Greetings and welcome to the third year of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History Social Justice Webinar Series, Workshop Wednesdays, a series focused on social justice community engagement. This series is brought to you by the Howard University Social Justice Consortium, or SJC, a cross-organizational, cross-institutional, interdisciplinary partnership that is concerned with educating society and developing the critical consciousness people need to analyze injustice in their own communities and develop innovative and collaborative action-oriented remedies. The SJC is made possible by the Mellon Just Futures Grant. Please go to the Howard SJC to learn more about the consortium, and we'll put that link in the chat for you. Tonight, we continue with our community-based educational social justice series with Social Justice 104, Black Resistance Across Time and Space, the Ways and Means of Existence, provided by our own Dr. Lisa Brock. Although this is the fourth workshop in this series, each workshop can be viewed independently. These workshops provide building blocks for a broadened understanding of social justice. If you have not already participated in the previous workshops, we encourage you to go to asala.org/social-justice, and we'll put that in the chat as well, to see all prior workshops and reading rooms and offerings. And to help you spread the word in your communities, the Social Justice at Asala Toolkit is also on the website, offering more details, information, and training tools. Just scroll all the way down that page. Well, we're going to get started in a few minutes, but I want to give you a couple instructions. Please introduce yourself in the chat and enjoy the conversation. We know that many of you are from Asala chapters, various universities, different parts of the country. Please let us know where you're from. We will engage in questions and answers and other interactive exercises at intervals throughout the presentation. So please enter your questions in the Q&A button area, and we will provide as many as possible to the presenter. Well, without further ado, I would now like to introduce W. Marvin Dulaney, President of Asala. Thank you.
Good evening and welcome to the Social Justice Workshop. Asala has always been engaged in social justice, and we're very proud to be a partner with Howard University for the series of social justice workshops. I want to start with a commercial. Asala is engaged in a national membership campaign, so I encourage you that if you want to be a part of some of the things that we do, because of course we sponsor Black History Month. We're the founders and sponsors of Black History Month. So go to our website, www.asalh.org, and just hit Join Asala. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce you, and I'm very pleased and honored to introduce Dr. Lisa Brock. Dr. Brock is a graduate of Howard University, and of course, she is also Professor Emeritus at Kalamazoo College. Dr. Brock.
Thank you very much, Marvin and Michelle. I am very pleased to be here. I've been working with this social justice grant for some time, and I'm very proud that they have chosen to keep me around and to keep doing this work. If you look at this first slide, it says resistance across time and space, the ways and means of Black existence. What I want to do here is I want to deepen the discussion of Black resistance, which is the theme for ASALH this year. I want to deepen some of the things that I've touched on in the earlier workshops that we did, webinars that we did, but also I want to sort of revisit some of that and deepen that discussion. But I also want to introduce some new ideas and some new people who are involved in resistance that I hope you will find interesting. Because I want to lift up some lesser known folks in Black history. And I think that's important for all of us. Before we move on, I want to say something about this slide. As you can see, I'm kind of playing with the idea of resistance and existence. I've switched them around from my original talk. Nick Hall, who works with our team, our social justice team, said to me a while ago that Black existence is resistance and Black resistance is existence. And so you could actually, this could be called, instead of resistance across time and space, it could be existence across time and space, the ways and means of Black resistance. Because for the last 500 years of colonialism, imperialism, and racism, to actually just live in our own bodies has meant to resist certain things in our world that have been against or in negation of who we are and our potential to be. So I'm going to be, playing with this idea of Black resistance and existence throughout this talk. When one thinks of Black resistance, the ways that we have resisted is infinite. And, I looked at some definitions of Black resistance, some types of Black resistance. I looked at the National Civil Rights Museum at the Lorraine Hotel in Memphis. And of course, there's tons of books that talk about different types of Black resistance, but trying to put them all together was very difficult. And I felt that the kind of schemas that I was looking at, they weren't very compelling, and they felt too tight, and they didn't feel expansive enough. So I took the time to kind of tease out some of the areas that I can think about, and I am sure that you all can think about some others as well. But these are some that I'm going to be working with today. So I came up with 4 broad categories. Green is defiance, the red is petition and protest, the blue is community building, and the yellow is psychic resilience. And I color-coded things that I think connect with those broad categories. So self-care, of course, connects with psychic resilience. Consciousness connects with psychic resilience. And then we have defiance, defying unjust laws. Of course, the civil rights movement, much of it was defying unjust laws because Jim Crow was the law. And so people, to break those laws, had to defy those systems. And then in petition protest, I'm talking about people who write, people who study, people who vote. And then in community building, I'm talking about Black memorialization, mutual aid, Black religious practice, and other forms of community building. And so what I'm going to do throughout this talk is we're going to revisit this schema as we move forward. And I'm talking, of course, I can't talk about everything. It's just too much. I have too much here to talk about in any real way. So I'm going to give some examples of some things that fit all the categories. And then I'm going to ask you to think about what you know about these categories. We have an interesting exercise sort of built into the overall program to help us think about ways in which these things happen. You should also see that they all overlap. Defiance, psychic resilience, community building, and petition and protest, they all overlap. And many of the things we do involve more than one thing. And so we're going to kind of try to tease some of this out and see some interesting examples of Black resistance, maybe some that you haven't thought about before. So runaway ads. Runaway ads it's such a rich primary account of what enslavement must have been like for those held in this system. I've used runaway ads before in my talks, but I want to emphasize something different here because, it's one of the things, Marvin is a historian. I know he understands these primary documents can say many things, not just one thing. And Edward Baptiste has estimated that there are about 200,000 runaway ads in the US alone. But here are three, one from the US, one from Brazil, and one from Haiti. And so there were runaway ads all over the place. I think in my previous talk, I talked about how they're very illuminating, how they often describe the physical condition and sometimes the social relations of the individual. It's very interesting. Some of these ads will say, well, you know, Jim ran away. We heard he has a girlfriend or a family member on plantation A or plantation B. So there's a lot of information that people could glean from these ads. And I suggest that if you want to do research, you begin to think about these. I also have talked about these ads in relationship to racial capitalism and the fact that newspapers, early newspapers in the 17th and 18th century could not have been run without the great number of ads that people paid to put in for runaways. And same thing with lawyers. Lawyers were often the ones settling estates and advertising estate sales, of course, of which a part of the estate sale was in fact the enslaved. And then of course, also the lawyers would also be at the auctions to adjudicate the transactions of money for our people. I want to touch on one thing before I get to the primary question, and that is that we use the word enslavement now. I've talked about this before, but I want to re-emphasize it, that because enslavement talks about the process of enslaving, which had to happen all the time and every day. Whereas to be a slave is like a static condition. And I don't think any human being is statically a slave. Every night that they go to bed, they dream of being free. And every morning that they wake up, they are enslaved again. And so I think this term enslavement is a very important word for us to begin to say, instead of a person was a slave, that we say a person was enslaved. Now to my primary question. So to run away is an existential question. So what do I mean by that? Existential question means that before a person would run away, they had to have it in their head that this is not just a physical thing, but that to run away was a psycho-emotional thing, that a person had to say, I do not want to be a slave. I do not want to be enslaved. I want to be a full human being. I want to control my own body. I exist. I am somebody. And you remember during the 60s, we had that saying on the placards, I am somebody. So for a person to run away, they have had to say that in their mind, that I exist, I am human, I'm a living being, I deserve better, I want to control my own body. So that's an existential question. To control one's body is a human and spiritual right. And every person knows that. So to run away wasn't just to relieve the physicalness. You had to have something in your head that says, I deserve better, and I want to be free. And I think this is important. And I'm going to say a little bit more about essentialism. So if you look at this slide, if you see the yellow up there, that indicates that I'm dealing with psychic resilience here as a part of my first schema. And I want to point to a person by the name of Frantz Fanon. I hope some of you know who he was. He was born in Martinique. He spent time in Paris. He spent time in Algeria. And he was an psychiatrist, a philosopher, an existentialist, an existential thinker. And existentialism is basically the philosophical belief that we are each responsible for creating purpose or meaning in our own lives. And we are somebody, and we have this individual purpose, and it's not given to us by governments, by teachers, by other authorities, or even by God. I think we just naturally have this in us. And we know it to be so, which is why so many people ran away, which is why we have Black Lives Matter, which is why we have immigrants fighting for justice, because we know it to be true, that we deserve to be treated not just fairly, but as human beings. We need to be able to thrive. as human beings, to grow like a flower. You know, flower knows it reaches to the sun. Nobody's telling it to do that. And we are very similar to that. So this is Frantz Fanon. Frantz Fanon talked about what he called psychic death and how to resist psychic death. And I've put, and psychic death is when you decide you're nobody. You don't reach for the sun. You decide to shrink. You decide to shrink. And he wrote 3 books that I think are very important for us to be aware of. One is A Dying Colonialism. The other one that's probably the most famous is The Wretched of the Earth. And the third one is Black Skin, White Mask. And what Fanon did is that he looked at the colonized and the formerly colonized in Africa. And he said there was a problem. He said the problem was that in The Wretched of the Earth, he says that Europeans like Italians and Germans and French and English, they came to Africa from these places, but when they got there, they became settlers. They had a power position and they had a foreign state, a colonial state behind them. A lot of those people that came from Europe had nothing in Europe, but because they were white and backed by colonialism, they all of a sudden became settlers and thought they had more rights. I mean, we could say the same thing here in this country. And he says they came and become settlers. He said for Africans, they were Igbo and Yoruba and Kikongo and Tswana. They were all of these people, different nations and ethnic groups like the Zulu. And all of a sudden in this relationship, they became natives. Relationship, power relationship between settlers and natives. Regular people ended up in this power relationship. And he says that power relationship did something to Africans. He said what happens to a lot of Africans, not everybody, of course, because there was severe actual resistance, but he said too many of them had a black skin, but they had a white mask. They wanted to be white. They wanted the accoutrements of what was considered whiteness. That means European colonial culture and all of that and what that meant. And he talks about that and says that is a problem in post-colonial Africa. And I would argue that is still a problem in post-colonial Africa. Now, what's interesting about this is that it kind of links with Orlando Patterson's text where he talked about slavery and social death. And social death basically refers to the condition of people not accepted as fully human by the wider society. I have a little problem with social death because, and in some ways, and I'm going to say a little bit about psychic death, is it occurs and doesn't at the same time. There's a tension in there. It occurs and doesn't at the same time. Because while some people end up living their lives as natives, even after colonialism, other people resist in a different kind of way, as the ones I just talked to you about in terms of resisting enslavement. And also, I think Patterson stretches it so far that it's like enslaved had no agency. The enslaved had no agency. I think among those who were enslaved, they created social networks to resist social and psychic death. Now, if you see, I put Du Bois up here in the corner because, of course, Du Bois dealt with his double consciousness. He said, we want to be psychically free. We want to be physically free. We want to be proud of being Black. We want our history. We want to be full human beings as Black people. What does it mean to be free to be Black? To take Nina Simone's song a little further. What does it mean to be free and Black? Can we be Black and be free at the same time? And so Du Bois is talking about accepting who we are, loving who we are, and identifying, resisting that kind of psychic death. But he also said in Double Consciousness that we're always seeing ourselves through the gaze of the settler or the white person. And so sometimes we lean that way in order to survive. And he says that that's a tension, that is a contradiction that we are always bearing. And Fanon said, resist the native part. Du Bois just explained what was happening. And of course, encouraging people to identify with themselves for who they are. So I wanted to put that in context for you. Any of these books would be great, and I can answer some questions about them. My next slide is I wanted to introduce you to some new folks. I want to turn to some folks who, in my opinion, resisted and continue to resist psychic death by promoting the Black self through cultural production and restoring Black collective history. And as you see, I have a yellow and a green. So the yellow is psychic resilience and the green is defiance, because I think these folks are working in defiance of unjust systems. And so the first person, so I'm going to turn to the African diaspora for this, because I imagine a lot of us know more about African-American history or US Black history than we do about the diaspora. So I thought in this, my fourth talk, I would mention some folks from the African diaspora who are actually doing this work. The first person I want to talk about is Ousmane Sembène, who is from Senegal, born in Dakar in 1923. Sembène, I mean, I just loved his films. I love his films. He's passed away, but he was an African filmmaker who eschewed Western narrative style and created a new cinematic aesthetic drawing on African storytelling traditions. He performed his films. He had his actors speak African languages, and he expressly produced films for African audiences. He really didn't care if Europeans loved his work or not. I mean, it was nice if they did, but actually a lot of people still don't know him, even though he is considered the grandfather or father of African film. I saw him, in fact, what he would do before he would even show a film internationally, he would go outside in a particular place in Africa, put up a big sheet and show his film to African audiences, because he wanted to know what they thought before he went international. I saw him once here in Chicago, and I was like right up in front because I just love his films. I'm going to talk a little bit about a couple of them. And I was enthralled by his clarity. And you know what he said? He said that before he could really make films in Africa, that he had to work with a camera lens maker to make a lens that would work with African skin, the darker skin, the different hues of African skin, and the African light. He said most of all of the lenses that had been developed up until the time he started working in the 1960s had been developed with European light and European people's skin tone in mind. So can you imagine? He literally worked to produce a new lens for his cameras that are now available to everybody who wants to shoot in non-European places. He wrote 8 books. He had 17 feature films and numerous documentaries. The 2 pictures that you see here of him, that's when he was a young man. This is with him. He was always had a pipe as a younger man. And I just wanted to mention 2 of his films so you can see what I'm talking about, especially in terms of psychic exposure of the psychic challenges that Black people, and especially what he's talking about is post-colonial Africans have faced. Black Girl was his very first film. It was produced in black and white in 1966. And to make a short story short, I'd encourage you to try to find it and look at it. It's not, I doubt if it's on YouTube or any other place. You probably have to go to a library. But it's about a girl, a young woman who is impoverished in a French-speaking country. She meets a liberal white couple who promise her a better life in France if she would be their nanny. She goes there to France, and she suffers from great alienation. She does not have her people. She does not have her culture. She has nobody to speak to. And the family seems to be oblivious to the fact that this young woman has been brought to a foreign land with no ability to integrate into that culture. And she ends up committing suicide at the end of the film. It's a beautifully shot film and a very sad film. But what he's talking about is the lack of psychic resilience on this poor girl's fault. And the fact I'm going to talk to you, and the fact that about how people resist that. His films resist that by talking about it, right? By exposing what can happen if you're culturally alienated. And then the film Hala, which is also one of my favorite films, is kind of funny, and it's set in a French-speaking country, and it's about a man, this man here, who's dancing here with his second wife. And it's funny because the film opens with the newly independent African country coming into being. The old French flag is coming down, colonial flag, and the new African independent nation flag is going up. And they're sitting in the national building, and a group of French bankers are sitting around with a group of Black business people, and they give them each a suitcase or a briefcase full of money. Each of these African men take their money away, and they go get in their Mercedes Benz, they're drinking their French water. And then he refuses to speak Wolof. His daughter is kind of a nationalist. She's a university student. She's trying to resist these neo-colonial accoutrements, and he's all up in them. He only speaks French. He wants her to speak French, not Wolof. But then he decides he's going to take a third wife. So he's got one wife, two wives, he's taken a third wife, yet he doesn't really appreciate African culture. And what ends up happening is a hala is put on him, which is a curse. He ends up being cursed with impotence. He cannot consummate his marriage with this 16-year-old girl, which is going to be his third wife. And the film ends, I won't tell you everything, because he's trying to figure out how to appease the people who put the curse on him. He's trying to figure out who cursed him. And so Simbene, I think, in this film is making a critique and saying that this man is a man who wants all the worst things from France in terms of he's a sellout. He's negating his own culture. He's trying to be French, but then and that's a negation of who he is. But then he picks up a tradition from Africa that is also a negative African tradition. And what you see in the film is that this man is a kind of a la carte cultural person. And in doing that, he picks what Simbene would see as the worst aspects of a kind of neo-colonial state. And it's a brilliant film. And I'm gonna, so I encourage you to look up Ousmane Simbene if you don't know who he is. My third person, who's also psychic resilience and defiance, is Gloria Rolando, who is probably the most well-known internationally Cuban filmmaker today. She lives in Havana. She's a personal friend of mine. I've known her for about 30 years. I've worked with her when she's in sort of the thought process and research process of her filmmaking. So we have been collaborators in some way, although all I do is respond to her questions. She's a brilliant filmmaker. She's been doing it for 35 years. She has 18 films. She's finally getting her just due. She's the only Cuban that has been invited to be a judge with the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. That's the Oscars that we just saw. But because of the US blockade, she can't get a visa here to participate. At least she hasn't since she's been inducted into that. But we were very, very pleased. She's a very productive filmmaker. And these two films that you see up here this is dialogue with my grandmother. And that's her grandmother as a young woman, and that's her mother as a baby. And it's about their history as Black women who are very interested in the arts and education. And it's a beautiful film dedicated to her grandmother after her grandmother passed away. And then the next film is, I did it. Excuse me. The next film is 1912. Breaking the Silence. This was a massive 3-chapter project about an uprising and massacre of largely Black peasants in 1912 that's been completely wiped out from history in Cuba. They never wanted to talk about it because it was Cuban soldiers that killed Black Cubans, white soldiers that killed Black Cubans who had fought for independence against Spain, But then when the US came in, the US said, we're not dealing with Black people. And the white Cubans, a lot of them went along with it. Some protested, but they went along with it. And the US then had a lot of control over Cuba. And Blacks said, we've been fighting for independence too. A lot of generals ended up being paupers and everything after the US invasion and occupation of Cuba in 1898. And so they rose up in 1912, and it's estimated between 4,000 and 6,000 were actually massacred in a really quick period, in like over 3 or 4 months. And so she broke that silence with this film in 3 chapters. So that's Gloria Rolando. I put the green circle for defiance for her and Ngugi and Usman Simbani. Oh, I forgot to talk about Ngugi. Oh yeah, I put the green there because they are defying systems. And we'll talk about Ngugi. They are defying systems of convention by doing their work. So you have Gloria in Cuba, who's defying systems by producing films. All her films are about Black people, and she's still living in Cuba, and, she's doing fine, and she gets some support from the National Film Institute. But a lot of her films were not wanted necessarily because Cubans have an ideology that we're all one, we're not race country, everybody's Cuban. But what Gloria says and other Blacks say is that, well, that means that we can't be seen, right? And so a lot of this history about Black people interrupts that kind of conversation about we're all Cuban, we're all the same. And so she is defying that. And then let me go back, because I forgot my buddy Ngugi here. Ngugi wa Thiong'o is a Kenyan writer, still alive, who basically is interested in the politics of language. This book called Decolonizing the Mind, The Politics of Language in African Literature is a very interesting one. I mean, basically when he started thinking about being a writer, he was like, how can I write in the colonizer's language about African situations? What will I lose? Can my people read it? Do I need the international audience to read it, or do I just need my people to read it? So he started writing in Kikuyu and trying to develop more writing in the Kikuyu language. And so he talked about this idea of writing in a foreign language about who you are. And it's really led to a huge debate in what is now considered post-colonial studies about how people from formerly colonized places speak at home their own language and then write in a foreign language, or do they write first in their indigenous language and then have it translated? So these are things that he was wrestling with. How do you decolonize language? And I'll give you a funny story. A good friend of mine who passed away a few years ago, named Willie Kogut-Sile, was a South African exile who was also a writer, and his native language was Setswana. And I brought him to Kalamazoo College, and my students in my class asked him, how was it to write in English when his first language was Setswana? And he said for many years, he didn't think he could write in English, because he said he thought English was a horrible, a gutter kind of language. It was a commercial language. It was a language that had very few words. It was not beautiful, he said. He said so, but he figured out that he could tame it. And the way he began to think about taming English was after he read Richard Wright's Black Boy. When he read Richard Wright's Black Boy, which he smuggled into apartheid South Africa, he said, well, if Richard Wright can write about the African-American condition this beautifully, I can write in English as well. And so he wrote both in Kikuyu and both in English. But one of the other things, I don't know if many people here, maybe Michelle and Marvin know, or maybe some folks who are really into music, but there was a group in the 1970s, a very irreverent group called the Last Poets. And the Last Poets actually got their name from a poem that Willie Kogut-Sile wrote, if you can believe it. Because he was living in New York and it was a part of the Black arts movement at the time. You know what I might do, Michelle? Christina, is before I go to my next slide, maybe we could stop right here with some, if people have any questions or anything they'd like to put in the Q&A, or the chat. Is that okay, Christina?
That is fine. Right now, we don't have any questions in our Q&A or chat, but I do have some notes in our chat here where people are saying they're loving the presentation and the information that has been presented thus far.
Okay.
People saying hello, of course,
Yeah.
and figuring out where they're from. There was one. Oh, my mouse got stuck. Sorry.
Okay.
We did notice you missed one of your videos earlier. If you wanted to go back to that slide and share that Bob Marley video at this time, you can squeeze that one in.
Okay. I think I'll just continue. Okay.
All right, works for us.
All right. All right. Thanks for reminding me because, I kind of, when I get going. Okay, we're going to keep going. So, because I'm kind of trying to move us from what I call the existential I am, to a more collective we are. And so I have both the yellow, which represents psychic resilience, and then I have the blue, which also means community building. And these are ads, actually, that the formerly enslaved had the Freedmen's Bureau put in newspapers at the end of enslavement. They were looking for loved ones. In case you all don't know, the Freedmen's Bureau was the national organization that went to the South to help transition the 4 million enslaved people into free people in this country. It was a huge task. They were continually undermined, understaffed, attacked by white Southerners as they tried to do their job. And some of them were even killed. They had to, so the military, literally, the Northern military had to be in the South to make this possible. But if you just look at some of these letters, you can see, Mr. Editor, I wish to inquire for my people. My stepfather was named George and mother's name was Shania. I am the oldest of 10 children and am named Carolyn. And you see, I had a brother, Orange. All were in Carroll County, Mississippi. Aunt Lydia belonged to Bill Thompson. And another one, I left my mother in Baltimore. Her name was Rosette Waters. She used to belong to William Hall. So when the Freedmen's Bureau actually went to ask people, well, what do you want? They say, I want to find my family. I want to find my loved ones. That's the first thing they wanted. The first thing they wanted. Again, it shows the humanity of a people. To me, this speaks volumes about Blacks as human beings connected to family and community. And, it's so interesting. Sometimes I've been in cross-racial discussions and white people are often surprised that we don't know where we come from in Africa because they can trace Ireland. Now we got DNA and people know more, can get more information. But before DNA, we couldn't know. And they had never thought of that. So I've been in some discussions where people say, wow, I never thought about that. I said, yeah, that's what enslavement did. And so separating families, both from Africa to here, but then also from here to there to here to there was also common. Also, people who were enslaved, of course, were sold not just across the US, but they could be put on a ship and taken to the Bahamas or Jamaica or Brazil or someplace else. And so when I think about collective consciousness, I wanted to put this term out here, Ubuntu. Ubuntu is a Southern Africa cosmological term. So it speaks to Blacks as human beings, Africans as human beings connected to family and community. And it's a part of Southern African cosmology, which is Ubuntu. And it basically means I am because we are. To love and be in relationship with family and community is to be human. And I'll never forget, I'm going to share a personal story. I'll never forget when I was doing research, dissertation research in Mozambique. I've got my PhD in African history, actually, and I was in Mozambique. And, you know, I'm a young woman by myself in my 20s, late 20s, doing research. And, you know, I'm researching for a PhD. That's pretty unique. Nobody cared about that. They wanted to know where my mother was. People always says, your mother let you come this far? Where's your dad? Who's taking care of them? You know, you have siblings? You know, it's really interesting to me because for me, when you're working on a degree, most people say, oh, that's great. Oh, you know, what's your topic? What's this? Most people didn't ask me that. They wanted to know where my family was. And it really struck me at the time. And I think this is still very much a part of the culture in much of Africa, and especially I'm most familiar with Southern Africa. So we're moving from the I to the collective. And
Dr.
now, yes,
We have a couple of
Got a couple.
okay.
Dr. Brocknick here. We had a question from Victor Palmer, who asked, Professor Brock, do you think that chattel slavery ended in 1865?
I think forms of chattel slavery still exist, and I think they existed before enslavement in different parts of the world, and enslavement of various sorts continues to exist. One of the things about forced labor is that it exists in all kinds of ways, and it gets sort of institutionalized in one way and in one place. And so we are in one area. And so we had enslavement in this chattel slavery, or chattel enslavement in this country and in the Western Hemisphere over a period of hundreds of years. And they were very similar from one territory to another, from Brazil to Cuba to Jamaica to here. They were all brutal, horrible systems, but we still have forced labor with the enslavement of millions of people in prisons in this country. And we have, I just read about there's still children dying, immigrant children dying on farms in this country as well. And so, yes, I think forms of chattel slavery still exist today. And I think that's important to understand. And one of the things that's so interesting is a lot of the torture devices and the things they did to people of African descent in the Americas had been used in Europe before. And as Europe has their political revolutions and people begin to get rights there, they bring all these devices here for Black people. So it's a very interesting way in which these systems have moved around. So yes, I guess, not in its exact same form, but in a form.
And one more question before we move on to the next slide, or two questions. Reverend Janet Garner Mullins asks, how has the Black church been involved in Black resistance?
I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a minute. I really am. I didn't forget the Black church, not just here, but religious practices other places. So if she could just hold on.
Okay, one might be more relevant now. Iris asked, Dr. Brock, where would you put or categorize our disconnection with our ancestry and the importance of it individually?
Well, it depends. I think it's very important to a lot of people. I mean, in terms of knowing, you know, where we came from, because in many ways we have become a people without historic roots to a motherland that we can identify. And I think that has had it's a weight on us, but what it has also done is it made us very strongly connected to our Blackness in this place, right? Because that's what we've had, that fight back. But the amount of Black people who are now doing that Ancestry.com now shows me that it is important to a whole lot of people to know that. And it's very interesting because there are now groups all over the US, at least I know, who have traced their DNA, the majority of their DNA, to one particular West African or I guess some from Mozambique as well, East African or Southern African countries, but the majority, of course, of Africans came from the West Coast. They've traced it to one particular place. And so there are now descendants groups in the US of some of these areas. I know Cameroon, one of my former students who's a scholar now, she's a part of a Cameroonian group of people who've done their DNA and found out that a majority of their sort of heritage and their people come from there. And they've taken trips there as a group. So I do know that it has become very important to a whole lot of people. And so it's one of those technologies that I think has benefited us and not hurt us like some other technologies. Nick, can I say something? Because you had asked me a question the other day and I have an answer for you.
Oh, yes, please.
The answer is Nick had asked me, what was the success rate of all of these letters? And I looked up and I was reading, I went on the National Archives site and then some other sites. And I finally found, I couldn't find any success stories. So I started flipping through the books and it, unless someone on this call, if you know someone who's written on this, like did Aunt Lydia find her family, you know, did George and Chania find each other and all of that. What Eric Foner says is that it was largely unsuccessful. And he says it was largely, these letters were largely unsuccessful because even if the people in a particular other place, let's say you're in Mississippi and you're writing to someone in Tennessee, the person in Tennessee might see it, but there was no way for them to communicate back to you or to get to you in these difficult times. Keep in mind the end of the Civil War. A lot of the South is devastated. There's a lot of violence erupting from whites on blacks. And especially when the Reconstruction era ended and the troops left, there was very little support for connecting people. So the Freedmen's Bureau wrote the letters, but they did not have the power and ability to actually connect people. So Nicholas, I found that answer. So these letters are beautiful and wonderful, but so far as we know, they were largely unsuccessful. Oh, I keep doing. Okay, now what we're going to do, we're going to have a little more interaction. What I've done with this schema, it was suggested, I think it's a great suggestion, that I circle the areas that I've talked about. And as you can see, they all overlap. I've talked about Ubuntu. I've talked about individual and collective consciousness. I've talked about self-care. I've talked about defying systems. I've talked about people who write and study. I've talked about cultural production and reinstating historical Black history and reinstating Black history and preserving Black history. And so what we want to do is an exercise that I'm going to let Christina tell you about.
So we are going to do an activity called a waterfall. And if you've come to some of Dr. Brock's other presentations, you've done this activity before. A waterfall is where everybody will enter something into the chat, but not until we say enter, and then we can see everybody's responses all at once. So at this time, out of the areas that are circled or highlighted, we're going to take time to put in something that we know about what Dr. Brock has talked about, or a fact. It could be a fact, it could be a book, it could be a movie, it could be a piece of art, it could be an artist, it can be anything that you know. And when I say enter, we will all hit enter at the same time about something that we know. So we're gonna give everybody about 30 seconds, and then Dr. Brock will come back and we'll read them all off and see, not all, we'll read off a group of them and see if we have any responses. So everybody take about 30 seconds, but remember, do not hit enter until I say so.
So if you know any examples of psyche resilience or any examples of Ubuntu or defiance, or people who write and study, or people who are cultural producers, or films or books or anything, please do that, as Christina said. And someone mentioned the Black church. So.
All right. I hope that was enough time for everyone. We're going to wait just a few more seconds. And if everybody's ready, we can hit enter now. All right. We have Dr. Burke. We have Sankofa. We have, oh, I scrolled too far. No, I didn't scroll far enough. Someone's father, Black Homesteaders of the South, Phyllis Wheatley, Daughters of the Dust, which is a film, Radical Healing, The Haitian Revolution, Black Joy is a form of Black resistance, A Raisin in the Sun, Du Bois, Black Panthers, Bob Moses, Toni Morrison, Nellie Fuller Jr. from Mother and Father, Black Lives Matter movement, Nat Turner, Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, and so many more. John
Wow.
Lewis.
Wow. Yes, you see, it's the list is infinite. As I said in my first slide, a Black existence is Black resistance. At some point, I'd like to know what people think. Maybe they can put that in the Q&A, what they think about Idris Elba saying he's not a Black actor, he's just an actor. On the one hand, I just want to hear what people think about that. I won't tell you what I think about it. But that's cool. So when you see this schema, I want you to continue to work with it and tease it out and think about ways in which we have resisted. Because, even like making a movie or writing a novel, the novel is good because the person, like Toni Morrison, is a great writer, but Toni Morrison wrote a truth about us, which is resistance, And so it's a very interesting idea that almost everything we do as Black people, almost all Black people, we do, when we speak to our condition, it becomes an act of Black resistance. So thank you very much for that. We're going to do a couple more of these, and we can talk a little bit more. And some of the things you said in that, I am going to talk a little bit more about. So now I want to lift up 3 people who I think you should know in Black history, who, in my opinion, took the notion of organizing for self and others like themselves with a sense of Ubuntu into movements. They all argued for a resistance to psychic death could come about collectively. The first person I've raised before, his name was Stephen Biko. He was from South Africa. He developed the idea of Black consciousness. And Black consciousness existed before he coined it and kind of took it to another level in South Africa. Of course, he read Malcolm. Of course, he read Marcus Garvey. Of course, he read Fanon. But he represented a generation that the first generation that was totally raised, for the most part, under the most vicious latter stages of the apartheid regime. And people like Mandela and others had been raised in earlier periods before the really complete Nazification of apartheid in South Africa, which came in 1948. In case you all don't know, South Africa's history started out as a colonial white supremacist colonial project and got worse over time, not better. And so while Mandela and them were in jail, him and his comrades and others are in and out of jail, this new group was coming in. And Biko actually studied medicine and was a doctor, believe it or not. He was one of 2 doctors at the time that actually had managed to go to medical school. And he argued that Blackness was not really a color thing. He argued that Blackness was a political thing. Of course they coincide, but he said being Black is political consciousness. And he says we have to wear it as political consciousness because of the way it had been weaponized against Blacks politically and socially. And he said Black people had to politicize their Blackness in such a way as to fight back. That's Biko. So I'm talking about Black consciousness there. The second person is Lucy Parsons. Sometimes she's been called Lucy Parsons Gomez. Her name is a little changing because of her background. She was Black and Mexican, it appears, but I think she considered herself Black. She was born in Texas. In 1851, she married a white man in Texas. They married each other and actually moved to Chicago. They were kind of run out of town because they were married. She moved to Chicago and spent most of the rest of her life on Chicago's North Side. She became very active in organizing unions, a part of the broad union and workers movement that was happening in the US and all over the Western hemisphere at the time. Railroad strikes, people fighting against everything at the time, decent salaries, child labor. In 1879, she helped set up the Working Women's Union, which is a group that, in addition to promoting collective bargaining, also campaigned loudly for the institution of an 8-hour workday. We should keep in mind, we don't have an 8-hour workday or a 5-day week because the businesses decided to give it to us. We have that because people fought and died for it. So, you know, I've seen these stickers that say you have unions to thank for your weekends, all right? Because there was no leisure time. People worked 16-hour days. They worked 7 days a week. You had child labor. And if you didn't work according to the owner, you could just be fired. And so they're fighting for the right to have an 8-hour day, a weekend, decent pay. And Lucy and her husband, Albert Parsons, became involved with the International Working People's Association, a group of loosely federated progressive labor unions that was also connected to folks in Western Europe. On May 1st of 1866, at a meeting at the Haymarket Square in Chicago, there was a huge protest for the 8-hour day. This was synchronized with people all over the world. And at that event, it led to police action against the protesters. A bomb was thrown and 2 police were killed. There was a trial of the labor leaders at the Haymarket they said they had killed these 2 police, even though they could not find one person that had thrown the bomb. And so 4 people were tried and hung, and one of them was Lucy Parsons' husband, who was hung for that action. And it's so interesting because in the US, there was one success. Over the next few years, the 8-hour day did come into being. And over the next decades, child labor was outlawed. But in 1894, Grover Cleveland signed into the 8-hour day I'm sorry, that was passed a little earlier, but the 8-hour day was passed a little earlier, but Grover Cleveland signed the Labor Day into law. So in 1894, he decided they were going to have a Labor Day. Now, what's so interesting, we know Labor Day is always that first weekend in September, but all over the world, they celebrate Labor Day, Workers' Day, as May 1st because of what happened in Chicago on May 1st. But the US leadership was so threatened by worker action, they did not want to empower them by making May 1st the Workers' Day, which would be honoring what they had done. And so a compromise was made, and the president made Labor Day in September. But if you go any other place in the world, May 1st is Labor Day. Then my third person is Audre Lorde. Audre Lorde started out as a poet and born in Harlem, 1934, became more and more open about her sexuality. And she began to write poetry. She said, poetry is the way we help give name to the nameless so it can be thought. And she is known as a Black feminist. She was known as a Black feminist and a lesbian, Black lesbian consciousness. And I think it's important to put all these consciousness out here: Black consciousness, class consciousness, feminist and lesbian consciousness, because Black people have been in the forefront of all of this organizing. LGBTQ organizing led by Black people. Workers' struggles led by Black people. Of course, Black consciousness and the consciousness of the Black self, of course, led by Black people. And what's so interesting about Audre Lorde is, I mean, look at what she wrote. Women, I mean, it's just a simple statement, but so many women were taught not to think this way. Women are powerful and dangerous. You know, watch out for us. You know, we got something going on, you know? And then she said, as a lesbian and a Black feminist, if I didn't define myself for myself, I'd be crunched into other people's fantasies of me and eaten alive. Eaten alive. I remember Angela Davis saying years ago that when in the 70s, when she would go to Black meetings, it was usually men talking. When she'd go to women's meetings, it was white women talking. And she said, where do I fit in as a Black feminist, as a Black woman? You know, where's my voice? And then, of course, lesbians are also faced with that. Are they just supposed to sit around and be quiet and act like they don't exist? And the reality is, she says, if we do that, we'd be eaten alive because they're denying who they are. And we've already talked about existentialism. And we're going to take another session after this. I mean, an interactive session. I put these three categories together because the first one represents Lucy Parsons, because Lucy Parsons went on to become one of the founders of a very important union called the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, which became a part of the AFL-CIO. And in case many of you have never thought about it, she was a seamstress, Lucy Parsons. That's how she made her living. And she would sew, you know, make clothes for people, white people, Black people, other people. And that's how she made her living. And a lot of women did that. And then as things become industrialized, it's women in the factories with sewing machines who are making our clothes. And so they organized a union very early to be treated fairly, paid fairly, not sexually harassed, if at all possible. And I think it's important that you know that a Black Mexican woman actually was one of the founders of that union. In the middle, we have Audre Lorde here. Audre Lorde was a part of the Combahee River Collective, and that was an organization that began meeting together in 1974 and went through the early 80s. They put this statement together, which was a very important statement. I'm going to read some of it to you. It says, it starts out with, during this time, we have been involved in the process of defining and clarifying our politics, while at the same time doing political work within our group and in coalition with other progressive organizations and movements. The most general statement of our politics at present time would be that we are actively committed to struggling against racial, sexual, heterosexual, and class oppression, and see as our particular task the development of integrated analysis and practice based on the fact that major systems of oppression are interlocking. These women, the Combahee River Collective and the Third World Women's Movement from the West Coast, the Combahee River Collective was in Boston. The Third World Women's Movement happened in California in the 70s. These are early movements of what we now call intersectionality. There would be no intersectionality without these women talking about it. And it's a term, it's a culmination in a term of actually active organizing. And actually most good theory comes from practice, and most practice comes from good theory. That's always been my argument. And it's a term we use for that called praxis. The Combahee, I wanted to mention, I don't know if people know, maybe we, Christina, we can see if somebody can put in the chat where that Combahee comes from. Does anybody know?
I am taking a look at the chat, so let me just give a couple of seconds, see if somebody drops something in. Shakita said Harriet Tubman, South Carolina during the Civil War.
Yes, thank you. What's her name? Shakita?
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Shakita. Yes, so in 1863, June 2nd, during the Civil War, Harriet Tubman became the first woman, not Black woman, first woman to lead a major military operation in the US when she and 150 African-American Union soldiers rescued more than 700 slaves in a raid on the Combahee River. So they rescued 700 slaves on a ferry, with a ferry on the river, and brought them across to the protected Union troops. So the Combahee River Collective literally pulled that out of a history of a very important Black woman, as we know, and that is Harriet Tubman. Thank you for that. And then the third column here is what Biko ended up inspiring. The Soweto uprising of May of 1976, for many of us of a certain age, we remember this. And we remember when the youth rose up, a lot of them were literally middle school kids, 13, 14, 15 years old. And Steve Biko had been talking about politicizing Black consciousness, and people were particularly upset when, and this was the spark, or the spark that started this particular uprising that literally continued until the end of apartheid. It never ceased. It just got bigger and bigger and bigger and spread. In Soweto, which is a large township outside of Johannesburg, the apartheid government had the nerve to tell all the Black teachers and everybody in the Black areas of South Africa that they had to teach in Afrikaans. The medium of instruction was Afrikaans. Students could only speak Afrikaans. Afrikaans was the white Dutch inspired language in South Africa. And the students said, no, we ain't doing it. First of all, nobody speaks Afrikaans in the world but there, so they wouldn't be able to read other people's literature. And it was the language of the oppressor. And they wanted to learn math in the language they were most familiar with, which was an African language. And so they literally resisted this effort, and teachers also protested. Some teachers were organized as well with their students, and this led to the Soweto uprising, which literally lasted over a year of uprising in Soweto and across the country, and it just kept going. It just kept going. Biko was picked up in August of 1977 by the security forces of the apartheid state, and he was killed by those forces in September of 1977. And when Biko was killed, the whole world in 1977 was like, oh my God, they didn't do that to that beautiful young man, and they did. And so there were a lot of songs about Biko. There were songs about Mandela as well, but a lot of songs about both of them. And so what I want to do now is I want to play a song about from Sweet Honey in the Rock on Biko, just a few stanzas of it. Thank you. I don't know if you caught the end where they mentioned Wilmington, North Carolina. They mentioned Wilmington, North Carolina because the Wilmington 10 case was going on at exactly the same time. Reverend Ben Chavis, a local organizer, and 8 high school students were charged with a crime for committing a crime that someone else had confessed to. Because they were arguing at the time, think about it, this is a time of integration, and the Black kids had, a lot of the Black schools had a lot of pride in their schools. They had Black teachers that loved them, they had bands, they had art, they had music, and all of a sudden they're supposed to be sort of mechanically integrated into a white school that doesn't want them. So the kids were shuttled over to this white school, and there was violence against them. And they were arguing, why can't we get money for our school? Which of course was the real goal of school liberation. It wasn't necessarily to be integrated. People were integrated because that's where the resources were. They wanted to be resourced in their own loving environment. And so these students started protesting that they had to go to this school. And so Reverend Ben Chavis, who is from Wilmington, went down and they were organizing. And you can see the trial transcript actually on the National Archives site. Is really telling. But they were actually convicted of starting a fire somewhere and were in jail at the time that Biko was killed. And so a lot of us, I was involved in that at that time in terms of freeing the Wilmington 10. And they ultimately did get free, but they spent some time in jail. So the Sweet Honey in the Rock is an a cappella group from Washington, D.C., founded by Bernice Reagan, who was a SNCC activist and singer with the SNCC Singers. And they connected what was happening with Biko and Soweto with the Wilmington 10, appropriately with the Wilmington 10 case. So now we're going to have another waterfall, Christine. And I think this time what we might can do, I don't know, if you could after the waterfall, maybe you could call out a couple people and have them speak about their answer.
If we have enough time, we will do that, Dr. Brock. We are going to do another waterfall. It is going to be the exact same way we did the first one, except we are going to look at these areas that are circled. So if you could take 30 seconds to get your statement, your movie, your book, your artist, your fact, whatever you may know, and we will drop it in just a few. And Dr. Brock, if you have anything you would like to say before
I would just say that, when as you see, I put institutional transformation here because in some ways, the young students, they were trying to change their educational system. When I talk about the Wilmington 10 and I talk about the Soweto young people, and also the kids started striking from school. They started calling liberation before education. They just refused to go to school until the system changed. And so you had a lot going on. And of course, I think Biko represents psyche resilience, and all of these, collective consciousness is about pulling together to build community, to fight oppression. And so there's a lot here. And there's, as I say, many of them overlap. But please put some more of your thoughts into the waterfall chat.
All right, and everybody can hit enter. All right, we have some coming. My chat's moving a little too fast. Let me scroll back up. We have a book, Sex and Race, volumes 1 through 3 by J.A. Rogers, Black Greeks, The Color Purple, Critical Race Theory, Bus Boycott, The Great Dismal Swamp, Defiance, Voting in Spite of Threats, Toni Morrison, Beloved is based on a real story of Margaret Garner. Why is my chat's not scrolling? I'll help you out. Thank you, Nick. Oh, there it goes. The book White Privilege, Protest Songs. Go ahead, Nick.
Warm December from Sidney Poitier. Voting in Spite of Threats. Got The Spook Who Sat by the Door. We've got
okay, I'm gonna
Black Coming.
Okay, so I'm gonna stop you there because
Say it loud.
Say it loud. I'm Black and I'm proud. I was 12 years old when that song came out. It changed my life. Anyway, 1968, at least that's the way I remember it. The person who talked about Beloved and Margaret Garner, is there a way for them to say what that case was? If they want to?
If they want to, give us just a second.
Dolores Walter.
Ms. Walters, you are have the ability to speak if you would like to do so.
Okay, so can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. Well, in 1856, Margaret Garner and her family attempted to escape from enslavement in Kentucky. But failing their escape attempt, Margaret Garner decided that rather than have her children returned to slavery, she killed her 2-year-old daughter and attempted to also kill the other children as well. It was a case that received much notoriety in the newspapers and was something that Toni Morrison was able to see in the newspapers as well. She used her imagination to tell the story, but the actual story is even more spectacular in so many ways. But essentially, she defied the system and decided what the outcome would be for her children in a time when parents could not parent their children. So it's a remarkable story.
It is. Thank you very much. I'm actually from Cincinnati, Ohio, and coming across the Ohio River there, which is a huge river, was seen as the Ohio River was the Mason-Dixon line. So I'm just adding to what you said. I appreciate what you said. So Margaret Garner had come across to be free, and then when the catchers came to catch her after they came across the river and they were looking for her, and she killed her son. And you're right, it became her daughter, I'm sorry. And it became a huge case for abolitionists to say, look how bad enslavement is, that a mother would kill their child rather than have them go back to enslavement. And there's actually a marker in Covington, the Covington area, right there on the other side of the bridge there in Kentucky, in honor of her. So thank you for that.
Well,
And
thank you.
so we may can get some more towards the end in terms of questions and answers. I'm getting close to. We have a couple of videos here that I want to show. So my final slide is looking at cultural memory, community, and historic preservation. I want to say a little bit about cultural memory. Cultural memory are those things that we remember in our culture that we don't necessarily realize came from Africa, right? So certain things we do have been maintained by us, and probably we maintained them because they were important to us, but over time, sometimes we've lost that they came from a particular place or time. So that's a little different than cultural construction, which so for instance, Kwanzaa. Kwanzaa is a holiday that was invented in the 60s to promote a kind of Africanness, to merge it with a holiday time, and to give African Americans some symbolic way to honor that particular connection with Africa. But we didn't bring Kwanzaa with us. I mean, Kwanzaa was not something we remembered. Kwanzaa was something that was invented, but it's based on African traditions that were then reinvigorated, mainly from Tanzania, some principles that were reinvigorated for the African American community. Cultural memory is something a little different. Cultural memory is when you go to an African American church and the preacher says, "Can I get amen?" And the people say amen. And in fact, if you go to a Black church and the preacher's talking and there's no response from the audience, like, amen, yeah, it's seen as not a good sermon. That call and response has been traced directly to Africa, especially West Africa. I had a friend of mine who did work in Ghana, and she said, you know how you go to a movie in the US sometimes in Black communities and people talk back to the screen? Don't go in there, don't go in there. She said when she's in Ghana, when she's in Kumasi, it's off the chains. It's a part of the performance of the film, the way people respond. So cultural memory is something we retain. And what I'd like to do before I talk about the images here is I want to play a couple of videos, and if you'll bear with me, okay, our time is cool, right? Yeah, it's cool. I want to play a couple of these videos and then we're going to be moving towards the end because I want you to see how cultural memory works. This first one is from Cuba and it is it's a performance piece, not the actual practice, but a performance piece that comes out of Santeria and the Orishas. The Orishas are the gods or the saints, kind of like the Catholic Church, that have different principles. They do different things. They have different colors associated with them. And Santeria is a religion in Cuba that is still practiced by many, many Cubans, blacks and whites, whites now, but blacks especially, that comes from the Yoruba-based traditions of religious practice. And that is definitely a cultural memory that has been retained in a way that, of course, it's changed while it was there in some ways. And we can talk in Q&A if people have any questions. But literally, some of the language they use actually and the drums they use have actually been retained. At least they say they've been retained from very early days of enslavement in Cuba. So I want to play this first. Thank you. There's a lot in there. Each one of those colors and people dancing represent a particular Orisha. The initial person is Elegua, who opens the way and closes the way for everything, which is why he comes out first. The woman in yellow is Oshun. She is the goddess of love and sex, and all kind of wondrous, magical things. And the woman in blue is Yemenya, who is the goddess of the sea. And so each one of those Orishas represent a pantheon of Orishas. And one of the interesting things I think about this too is that, you know, in African traditions, music and dance were always a part of spiritual practice. And that's why I think when you go to an African church, you have a lot of music, African-American or a Black church, you have a lot of singing, and you also have people moving. One of the interesting things, there's a wonderful book by Sam Floyd called The History of Black Music, Making of Black Music, something, Sam Floyd, I can't remember it right now, I just thought of it, where he talks about how the Black church in the US separated what they thought was too sensual a dance in religious practice, which in Africa, a lot of the dance they do may be considered sensual by Western eyes, but that's what they did. It was not a problem. Protestants had a problem with it. Africans did not have a problem with moving your hips and moving your body. But when they came here and became Christian, it became a problem. And so you end up with the Black church saying, we can't do that, but we still can move kind of up and down. And he talks about that in a very interesting way. And the division that happened in Christianity with a lot of Black religious practices here. I'm going to play another video now that's actually about US Black social dance, and we can talk about that too. Wow. And you see, it's funny now, this craze with the dancing, it's all over TikTok, it's all over, everybody's doing it, studying it. But for African Americans, as they talked about, this has just come. This is what cultural memory is. That drumming and dancing and the Orishas in Cuba did not come from Europe. They come from Africa, even though I think I made and call and response in our churches. They did not come from European culture. They came from African culture, even if we don't always know that they came from there. I remember being in a church, actually Reverend Jeremiah Wright's church, which I used to go to when he was still preaching. And I remember after the dance ministry and then Wright had preached, and I leaned to a woman next to me and I said, you know, this whole thing comes from Africa. She said, oh, no, honey, it come from Mississippi. And I said, yeah, it comes from Mississippi. And I didn't get into a big discussion with her, but I wanted to say it's in Mississippi because it comes from Africa. And of course, that kind of bopping and Charleston, all of the American dances, by and large, have come from African Americans' cultural memory. And, you know, in the interest of time, I think what I'm going to do is I'm not going to play my final video of Fred Lincoln, but I'll talk about him. This image here is a picture of me a few years ago, and I think it was 2017. And this is Fred Lincoln, and that's my husband, Otis. And I've been doing research on Charleston, enslavement in Charleston, in the urban enslavement in Charleston. And we met Fred Lincoln because he was a friend of ours. And he lives in Wakando, which is an area outside of Charleston. It's a rural area where he and his family have actually managed to keep 300 acres in the family. And the image you see on the left is their family cemetery, the Venning Cemetery. And they take care of it. It's beautiful. They do all the maintenance of it. They're trying to get it to be a historic site because the developers, of course, are breathing down their necks. Literally, it was bought at the end of the Civil War when a lot of whites were fleeing the South and they were selling their land to African Americans just to get something, but they were not going to live in a place where African Americans were free. So people actually did buy land. So he and his family continue to live on the land and take care of the land. They even have white tenants on the land who live in trailers and expanses of the land. And it's really interesting because he told me, we were there in 2017, and he told me that some of those whites that lived in the trailers actually had Trump signs on them, but they pay their rent to him. And so we talked about that. But I would suggest that you look him up online. That he's been continuing to fight for the preservation of their collective family ownership. They also have a school that they built. He told me once that around the 1940s or 50s, he said some white terrorists came and tried to take down the school. And he said they were met with equal power and they've never been back. So it's a pretty powerful story of the Vennings and Mr. Lincoln. And my final couple of slides are all four of my categories: community building, psyche resilience, defiance, and petition and protest are all involved in our fight for Black history. There is an attack on Black history right now, as we know, being led by DeSantis in Florida. And what I've been doing is looking at memes on Facebook and trying to collect them because it's a very interesting, popular way to see how people are responding. And this first picture on the left is a picture of Ruby Bridges, who was the first little girl to desegregate school in the South in New Orleans. And her parents, worried about her, but she actually did do it. And this meme says if this child, they had to be escorted by police and federal agents because of the violence that was all around. And it says, if this child was strong enough to survive that, your child is strong enough to learn about it. Because of course, the whole fight against Black history is one, it's twofold. They don't want Black people to know their own history, which of course we fought for, so that we can have psyche resilience, right? So that we can know who we are, because that's a part of being human. Know who you are, where you come from, what you've done, what your people have done. And so if they can separate us from our history, then it's more likely that they can actually oppress us. But they also don't want white people to learn Black history, because white people, if they learn Black history, they would understand why inequality exists, why things happen today in the Black community and across communities. They want to paint like Black people are poor just because they can't, they just can't get it together. But no, it's historical. And if you don't know Black history, you can be told anything. And it's interesting. Sharpton said the other day, what's the opposite of woke? Because DeSantis and Trump are on this anti-woke thing. The opposite of woke is sleep. And that's what they want. They want people to go back to sleep. And so this is actually a response to, in fact, I think what me and Marvin and Howard and everybody has been doing over the years to teach Black history. And so they are worried that we are becoming too free, and they've got something else in mind. So they want us to go back to sleep. So we got to fight for Black history. This meme is so interesting because it's two white kids, because of course this movement says that white kids are being traumatized by this Black history. And you should know, I taught in multiracial classrooms for 36 years. My students were not traumatized, my white students. My Black students and white students often responded differently, but the response was not to trauma. The Black students said, yeah, I know that's what it was. I just didn't have the data, but I know. And I'm so glad you shared that, Dr. Brock. And the white kids would say, why were we lied to? Why were we lied to all our life? Why do I have to come to college to learn this? And they're mad as well. So this is what they don't want. They don't want their kids to become anti-racist. So this ad says, my parents say that reading about Hank Aaron and Roberto Clemente, that's two books that were initially banned in Florida, will traumatize us. And this meme is, we got all this mass shooting going on, and these kids are worried about, or their parents are worried about two books about two Black baseball players. And there's DeSantis trying to white out Black history. And this meme is the number of school book bans by state. Texas has the largest. Florida has a second as well, and West Virginia. So people are banning, that their Beloved is banned in some states. We talked about that. Some of these are James Baldwin, Kimberly Crenshaw, etc. So I wanted to definitely show you that. And I think I'm going to just end with this slide, and we won't have another waterfall. Maybe we'll have some time to take at least a couple of questions, Christina. I want to end on Black joy, because I think, to me, Black joy is in some ways the greatest phenomena of Black resistance, right? It's a way in which we're going to say, you can do what you want, but you are not going to take everything from us. And cultural production has been a way that we've been able to experience Black joy, as well as building community, defying all of that. But a lot of our Black joy has been in our cultural practice, and that has been because it's something they can't control. We can sing, we can dance, they can't control that. And so this is an image from Pinar del Rio in a province in Cuba. I love it. This is a real picture that I took, actually. It's a beautiful, beautiful place. And you see those hills, they're called magotes. And they look like mountains, but they're called hills. And they have a lot of caves and water, fresh water in them. And they became a place where Maroons ran to create new societies. So runaway enslaved societies, runaway societies of the formerly enslaved were created inside these hills. And the land was very fertile, and so they could be able to actually sustain themselves, as you can see that lush land. So I want to say something else about Black joy. It's a very interesting Tara Hunter wrote a book on Black women just after enslavement, and she found a Freedmen Bureau's quote from a Black woman who was asked by the agent, the Freedmen's Bureau agent, what did she want to do with her life? What did she want to do? And she said, to joy my freedom, just to joy my freedom. That's so interesting to me, because she meant enjoy, but she also talked about joy. To be joyful is to be happy, and to be happy and joyful is also to fulfill a kind of human, and I don't just say human, I think a promise. Just any kind of living thing wants to feel joy. And so I want to end with John Batiste. I realized I have an H in there, and I think it's just Jon. But I want to play his video Freedom. If you haven't seen it, this picture brings me joy. This song brings me joy. And I want you to think about what brings you joy. And maybe that's something we can talk about. Now, if that don't make you move, I tell you. Thank you. I'm going to end there. And I want to thank you for listening to me this evening. I'll turn it back over to the coordinators.
Well, Dr. Brock, as usual, it was wonderful. We're going to make sure you get a copy of what's all in the chat, because people have really just loved what you did. The discussion in there was so interactive and full. And
Okay, can I say something, Michelle?
Sure, please.
He's calling this, he says, this is freedom, this body movement. And I think when you think about Black joy and you think about the way Black people produce culture and the way we move our bodies and dance, it's moments of freedom. We feel free when we can move our bodies and dance. And it's also a cultural memory, right? Because it doesn't come from European culture, this kind of dancing. And then when he said, when I look at the stars, I know who exactly we are. And you had the Black Indians from New Orleans. That's obviously in New Orleans there. And so much is in this, the marching bands, everything in terms of Black culture is in this. And to me, it's really about freedom and joy and who we are. And so that's why I showed it.
Well, thank you for ending on that note. I really want to thank the audience for participating and being with us tonight. This is just our first in a series of events for this year. Our big events occur at the ASALH conference, which will be in September in Jacksonville, Florida, and we hope you'll come there and join us. I see our president, Dr. Delaney, has joined in. Dr. Delaney, would you like to add some remarks, please?
Actually, I just want to commend Dr. Brock for a wonderful presentation using video, music, using the full Black experience. So I just loved it. So thank you so much.
Thank you. There were a lot of questions about viewing. And so again, you can go to asalh.org /social-justice to see all the offerings provided by Social Justice at ASALH. And this video will be added to that array within the next coming weeks. And so we hope you'll take advantage of that. And I want to give one more plug for our Social Justice at ASALH toolkit. That toolkit's on the site, and there's actually a video where Dr. Brock did a tutorial of an earlier version of the toolkit. We've been updating it along the way. So those are two items that I think you'll love. And at the conference, there'll be another one of those tutorials live by Dr. Brock, and we will distribute hard copies in your hands. So please find all our information there and stay in contact with ASALH. And more than anything else, please join. This can't happen without your membership and your participation. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Have a good week, and we look forward to seeing you at our next Social Justice at ASALH event. Good night.
Good night, everybody.